Hey, 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 Trundle Talks, it's Trundle Talks, it's Trundle Talks, it's Trundle Talks.
Hey everybody, welcome to Trundle Talks. This is the second episode of season 2, and I'm your host Sajid Nair. Now, with us today, we have Rachel Wright. She's an Atlassian Community champion, a certified Atlassian Jira Administrator, and the author of the book called Strategy for Jira. We're going to talk about how she became a consultant and how you can build a career in Jira and Atlassian administration as well. Now, without further ado, let's get on with it.
Welcome, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of Trundle Talks. We are very excited to have you here. I've been a big fan of the content that you write in terms of Jira administration. I've been in awe of the work that you've been doing as an Atlassian community, not just a leader. I would call you an Atlassian community champion. I've heard you at multiple places. I've heard your podcast, and I'm very excited to have you here with us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's nice to be here. And Jira's my favorite thing to talk about, so it's easy.
Awesome. So let me just start with the most easiest question. How did your journey start as an Atlassian or a Jira specifically consultant? How did you start, and how was your experience with the entire process?
Sure. So my consulting journey started a long time ago. I think I've kind of always been a consultant. I started after high school. I was in the web development industry, and I started a small business, and I ran that through college and through some other jobs. And through web development is how I started using Jira. So I started using Jira as a user in about 2011, and then I became an admin, and then I got my certification. And now I'm trying to help users not make the mistakes that I made with the configuration, because believe me, I made them all. I made them very well.
Yeah, and that brings me to the most obvious question that, how do you deal with that, with the entire experience of working with different organizations? Because I'm sure you would get, whenever you get into any consulting engagement, you would see a lot of people having, too many admins on a site or too many custom configurations. How do you handle it? How do you approach such a situation?
Sure. Well, the worst case I saw was 123 application level admins. So, that application was a huge mess and everyone was changing everything every day. As a consultant, the first thing that I come in and I try to do is to listen. What are the problems you're having? What are you not getting out of Jira that you should be? And every company should really have a list of questions that they want Jira to answer for them. And the reporting should really drive the configuration. A lot of companies come in and they start making configuration changes immediately. And then later on they say, oh, but wait, we can't get this information out of Jira because everyone's doing it differently. So my job as a consultant is to gather that information, understand what their pain points are, what they'd like Jira to do for them, and then give them an idea how far they are away from achieving that goal, maybe how far they've strayed from the default configuration, and what are some small cleanup steps they can take now and then in the long term to get them to where they need to be.
Sure. It's interesting you mentioned that, I've read it in some content that you wrote that about working backwards. What's the end goal that you want to achieve, about what are the reporting needs, and from there work backwards. Do organizations take it in, good spirit that, hey, we've been using this tool, this consultant comes in and tells us that we have to change our entire process? How do organizations take that?
It depends, and it's always different, and it's always interesting to see those companies that are ready to change. And it's usually because they're just not getting something that they know Jira can do for them. Jira can solve so many problems, but if your configuration isn't set up to solve that problem, you probably have some pain points. You probably have some users who aren't so happy. So those companies are probably more likely to listen to some advice, to make some changes. And then you've got other companies that are sure that their configuration is perfect. And, the Jira Administrator is a little hesitant to make changes, provided by an outside consultant that couldn't possibly understand what they're going through. So part of my job is just making them understand that, I've made this mistake before. Here's how I made it. Here's what it resulted in. Does that sound like what you're experiencing? And if so, here's how you can change it. And one thing I like to do when it's possible is I like to help the admin solve their own problems. I don't like to come in and say, I'm the admin now and I'm going to solve all your problems for you. I like to train the admins and show them my thought process about how to go about cleaning up and making configuration changes, and then having them do it, because they will learn much more, and they certainly know more about their organization than I ever can.
Right. Makes sense. I would also like to ask you that when you talk about tools versus process, when it comes to embracing the agile values, you talked about coaching, and how do you deal with when we talk about that one of the agile values is individual interactions over processes and tools, and our focus when we are talking about Jira is specifically towards processes and tools. How do you draw a balance between those tools and the processes and teams that are using those tools and processes?
Well, so it's interesting, and this is probably not the answer that you'll expect. I've never seen Agile done well. I definitely believe it can be done well. It's not that I'm anti-Agile at all. I've just never experienced it, and I would love to work with a company one day who's benefiting from it, getting everything out of it that was intended, and really loving the process. I just haven't seen it. So for me, I approach Jira as process and methodology agnostic. You can have a specific process or no process at all, and Jira can still solve a lot of problems for you. So it kind of depends on the methodology that the customer is using, what they're comfortable with, and what they're moving towards in the future. What do they want this application to do for them in 5 years?
Interesting. So when you say you look at Jira as process agnostic, does it help you build the solutions, because it's you using Jira as a single source of truth? Do you then work around the requirements, or do you propose that these are some changes that you should do in terms of process as well, because those are required when you're looking for the reporting capabilities that you want?
Actually, this is one mistake I made early on. I tried to get my organization to use Jira the way Jira was built, and not necessarily configure Jira the way we worked. So that's one tip I have for people. Jira is flexible and infinitely customizable, and it doesn't mean that you can't use whatever your process is in Jira. One other thing I recommend is you don't necessarily need to mirror your process exactly in the real world. For example, if you've ever seen a workflow that has 40 steps, they've probably tried to mirror every little thing they do in the real world. And it works, you can do it. It's not necessarily the best way to do it. Users usually hate clicking through a 40-step workflow.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen those projects where 15, 20 workflow steps with 20 post functions jammed into them just to, be more automation friendly, but it ends up being more manual work for the admins to manage, for the teams to go through.
Right. And what help did it give you, right? It probably just made your life harder. So I like to say that, it's good to have a process, but your Jira process can be a subset of your real world process, and use Jira where it really makes sense. Don't try to do a one-to-one mapping, because I've tried that and it didn't work very well.
Okay. Makes sense, definitely. Rachel, how do you keep up to date? Because every other day there's something new coming up, some new add-on that's coming up on the marketplace, any new plugin updates, with the end of service sale announcement. How do you keep yourself up to date as a consultant with everything that's happening in the Atlassian community and the domain?
You're right. Everything changes so quickly, especially now with cloud. For me, the only way to keep up is to actually use the tools and to use them in interesting ways. So I'll give you a couple examples. I have cloud instances, I have server instances. I keep them both and I use them all for different things. I have multiples. I use one cloud instance, for example, to track the work that I'm doing for my own company. And then I have a different Confluence instance, for example, where I track my adventures outside of work. So my partner and I, we travel full time. We live in an RV and we've been on the road for 5 years. So every time we change locations, there's a Confluence page that's a template where we fill in all the information we need to know about that location, everything from where we're staying to how much it's going to cost to what other directions. And by using the tools, both for what they're made for and in other ways, you're forced to see the changes. You're forced to find ways to make it work. And that's really the only way I can keep up.
Yeah, that's basically practice what you preach, right? When you are trying to use those tools to use them not just in the technological sense, but actually in your day-to-day life. That's great to hear. Do you use like any other tools in the Atlassian domain as well, like maybe Trello? I've heard a lot of leaders use Trello for
Yep,
their
I use
personal
Trello.
planning.
Yep. I did a trek in Spain 2 years ago. I walked 100 miles on the Camino de Santiago, and I planned the whole thing in Trello. And I used Trello just because I wasn't as familiar with it. You know, my safety place is Confluence for planning trips and adventures. But I used Trello just so I could understand how it worked a little better.
Nice. That's great to hear. Rachel, one question that I have for you, and it might be a generic question, but I want you to like shed some light on how can somebody become a consultant? Like, what's the roadmap? So let's say I am an Atlassian admin. I have worked with organizations, I have worked with teams. I know how the teams work, how the tools work. But a consultant is completely different ballgame because you have to be empathetic. You have to, understand what the customer is trying to say. What's the roadmap on becoming a consultant?
So for me, my advice is to start small. Start with one small project. And maybe it's helping out a nonprofit on the weekend. Maybe it's setting up a new Jira instance for the company that just opened up down the street. Maybe it's helping somebody who has been using for the tools for the long term, but they're struggling. Do one small project, probably do it volunteer, and then use that to not only, get into the consultancy, but to create your own processes. So you're set up to help others. You'll see that there's a repeatable process, everything from when you first meet the client to how you close out the project to how you bill, your taxes, all the other little things that consultants get to do that isn't related to the product at all.
Mm-hmm. That's great. One final question, Rachel. How do you feel the community, the Atlassian community that you're a part of? I myself have been a part of the Atlassian community. How do you feel that has affected the way that you are using Atlassian tools, and how, what impact has that community have in the work that you do?
Well, that's how you and I met. We wouldn't be doing this today without the Atlassian community, right?
Yeah.
I love the community. I've been a member since 2013. And I'll tell you, there's really no industry I've been a part of that has this same atmosphere, people helping people. And I really think that as a consultant, if you approach what you're trying to do from a helping perspective, if you approach it for, I want to make $1 million, I don't feel like you're going to be very successful. But if you approach it for, I want to help people, I want to prevent them from making the mistakes I made, and being part of the community gives you the ability to do that. It gives you access. It gives you colleagues to talk to work through problems. I can't say enough good things, both personally and professionally, about the Atlassian community.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rachel. We're so glad that you could share your insights with us. I would definitely recommend reading the book Strategy for Jira. And there's another knowledge document that Rachel had written with Boatron software that's out there on their ebook, available as an ebook on their website. Check that out, guys. Thank you so much, Rachel, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, hey.